Right, welcome back. So today we want to now focus on what to do, right? So in the previous episode, I explained what not to do, but on this one, we're focusing more on what you should do. So in a real world application, right, you basically have a client. Your client can actually be a mobile app, sort of CLI, or a web app, as the case may be, right? So your client makes requests, as you can see over here, it makes HTTP requests to, to try to make the request to your backend, right? That's the intention. But in real world, you don't want to do that because of, some downside of things that we discussed in the previous episode, right? But now what we are doing is that we're putting a middleman, and that middleman is Cloudflare, right? A Cloudflare is a service that basically offer lots and lots of services like WAF protection, means web application firewall, right? So basically, what it does for you is that it makes sure that it protects you against any form of XSS attack, any form of bot attack, right? Because you could have a request and these scripts can be injected into that request, right? But then with WAF, what Cloudflare does is basically removes all of those, external dependencies and then block the request, right? So basically, what you have on the Cloudflare layer, it allows you to do the WAF protection, allows you to do the rate limiting, as well as the caching at the top level. Right. So we're going to explain what each of these basically mean. I think it might be a bit confusing if you're just seeing it for the first time. So I'm going to go through the different structure and explain that. Right. So now we see a very different view here. And from here, what I've done is I basically like explained the different structure with Cloudflare. You can see the first part is when you're dealing with your DNS configuration, and then the other one has to do with your WAF protection. So now let's talk about the DNS setting. Right. So immediately you have your your Cloudflare integrated in your domain, right? What will happen is that your IP address of the domain becomes hidden, right? So the client will be making a request to Cloudflare servers, to Cloudflare X server. It could be in any location of your choosing. It could be I'm in Nigeria, so it's going to be in Nigeria. You choose other locations like Europe and all of that, right? So your client is going to hit Cloudflare server, and what happens is that Cloudflare server hits your backend, right? Which is response, right? So when your backend is giving back a response, it passes through again the Cloudflare server and then over to your client, right? I don't know if that is a bit confusing, but let's think of it this way. The middleman is in two forms. It comes at the point of making request. It comes again at the point of serving the response, right? At the point of making a request, your client makes a request. The Cloudflare X server picks that request, channels it through the X server, and the X server points to your backend to say, okay, I need this information after verification that, okay, this request is not malicious. This request is not coming with some sort of SSS scripts and all of that. So it passes through your backend server, and your backend server basically say, okay, everything looks good, and give you back a response, right? So it gives you back a response, and that response again passes through Cloudflare to make sure that nothing crazy is going on, and it could actually cache it in cases of caching, right? We'll talk more about that in a bit, right? Cache that response and do a couple of other things with it, and then serve it to your client, right? So the middleman, which is Cloudflare, happens at the point of making the request, and it happens at the point of what? Saving the response. Right. So I believe that that's a bit explanatory. Don't worry, we'll actually practicalize all of this. We'll be running like a proper project where we'll explain how all of this come up in real world, right? So let's talk about WAF, right? So WAF, like I said earlier, stands for Web Application Firewall. So it's just a protection mechanism that strips, from request any form of malicious script, SSS attacks, and all of that, right? It could just be scripts, SSS scripts that they've put in here. Like I gave an example here. An attacker can be able to target a /login endpoint, and it can put a password like this, right? You can say password, or it's trying to do some SSS scripting right here, right? But then what Cloudflare will do is that it's just going to block the request. But assuming you don't really have like Cloudflare installed, this is going to pass through to your server. And if on your server, on your backend, you don't really have some proper validation library like Joey and all of that, it passes through easily, right? Passes through easily, and then it's game over. So we try to actually prevent that. Even if we still have to do all those kind of app level validation, we should do it at the gateway level, which obviously is what Cloudflare is doing at this point, right? So there are a few other things that it does for you. It tries to strip from your request SQL injection, XSS, bot crawlers, exploits, and so on. Right. I hope that helped. So now this is basically how Cloudflare basically sit at the middle level in between making requests and getting responses. So there's actually a separate layer which is very important that I might not have mentioned with Cloudflare is that it actually allows you to do a couple of other things like global rate limiting and all of that, right? So at the Cloudflare level, you can set, for every request, this is the amount of request users can make per minute, right? So when you have this, attackers can really go beyond that request per minute, right? So, and in the real world, it is advisable to have rate limiting at the global level as well as on the app level, right? So that you can actually protect much more sensitive routes, right? Like payouts, deposits, and all of that, right? So you can protect all of those so they are not easily abused. Right. So a different layer that we have here, which is very interesting, is the proxy server or the load balancer, right? So let's talk more about the proxy server. I think this is very important. And the way proxy server works, I'm just going to go here and explain it to you guys in a bit. So we're going to make some drawings. I think that would help. So now you could actually, a proxy server obviously is, before I explain proxy server, I think this is actually a very good way to explain Cloudflare. Cloudflare being a middleman is actually a reverse proxy server. Right? It's doing reverse prosing for you, right? But then let's talk about an actual proxy server. So a proxy server can just be so for example, we have a server here, we have a server here. So we're gonna call this server one, right? So call this server one, right? So let's call this one server one. That's very tiny. Let's make it extra large. All right. So again, you guys can see it. All right. So we can actually delete this, and I'm just going to call this server two. I think I did something similar before, but let's see. This would be our server two. Server two. So now you might ask, what's the difference between server one and server two, right? And let's go here. Right, so server one happens to be your main server, right? So this is actually your main server, and it has like, a domain, right? For example, so you can actually call this main server, say main server.com, for example, right? So this server basically has its own like domain name, and every request basically goes through here as your backend, for example. So we can just call this. It can be like a subdomain. Doesn't really matter depending on how you want to structure it. It can be api.mainserver.com, for example, right? And in your server too, you could actually have, something similar. Here we can call it API proxy, right? And so in server 2, we want to make some very important, you know, important declarations, right? So we want to make sure that the allowed origins are basically limited, right? It could be asterisk, since you basically have here, you have a bunch of subdomain in main server. We can use a wildcard, and we can define the allowed origins like this, right? So if, for example, the clients you're using, a combination of, say, mobile app and web app, right? So you could have something like this, mobile, All right. So you could have something like this. So now there's something interesting about the web client and the mobile client. So web client, basically, you can block allowed origins. So if you have allowed origins set to asterisk main server.com, for example, I think we're doing something like that. So what will happen is that only requests from anything main server.com will be able to access the proxy server, right? But on the mobile doesn't care about origins, right? So any origin basically goes through. So I'll actually explain later on how you can protect more of mobile, right? But web app, it basically routes through that. So now let's talk about the mechanics. How does the proxy server basically connect with your main server, right? So on your backend, you can actually put them on different ports. Doesn't matter. This one can be on port 500. This one can be on port, on port 600, right? All right. So port here can be 600, 6,000. Sorry. All right. So once we have different ports like that, it kind of creates this kind of difficulty level. It helps the difficulty level for any form of attacker to even know what's going on, right? So when a process server makes the only a process server knows what the backend system looks like, right? In the backend system, you can actually set an extra layer of security, which is on your server level. You can set private networking, right? Private networking on the base level would allow server to connect directly to server one without needing a domain whatsoever, right? So I can come here now and disable this, remove the domain, right? Voila. So server 2 only knows access to server 1 because they're connected via private networking. No external party or client can be able to connect to server 1, right, without passing through server 2, right? And but before you pass through server 2, you need to have your allowed region mapped that structure. Right. I hope that makes sense. Right. So at the top level, this is how you process your server. But this route now is what you send over to your client. Say, for example, your mobile or your client. We actually be using right. So spell right. So your mobile, your web client will be using this particular URL to access your server. I hope that makes sense, right? So the other things to explain, I'll move quickly into the other parts as well. Right. So as you can see, we have your process server, which I've just explained. Your process server will route to your backend, which is your actual API server, like I explained here, which is server one, right? And when that happens, we can actually do more things on our end on the backend. On the backend, you can actually do a few things, right? No, not at your your proxy server can do the IP filtering, local rate limiting, routing. This could be done on the on a proxy server. Remember, your proxy server is just your own server, your own backend, but rather it's actually connecting to the main backend, right? And there are a few other options that are available on the main backend that are really hidden from the process server, right? So now when you go here and you have your API server, so what normally happens is that on your API backend, you do some level of middleware validations, right? So you could have like authentication middleware, you have validation middleware, you have login middleware, right, which contain your other middlewares that contains like your business logic. Right. So this middleware level is very important, right? Because say for example, a user basically access a route in your platform, say slash payout. First of all, you need to be sure that they are authenticated, right? You need to make sure that they need to be logged in for you to even know who they are. And then the validation layer. This is the most important layer of the middleware level. I will repeat that. This is the most important layer. Why? Because if you misuse the validation layer, there's actually a very large chance, a very large percentage, of attackers abusing your system. Even when you have the whole Cloudflare, the whole security measure, and all of that, when you don't do proper validations of your input, you're going to be in a very big trouble, right? And that's the more reason when you're having your input on the app level, on the backend level, you need to have proper validations, right? And there are libraries that really help with this, right? There's the Joy library for validations, there's Yop library for validations, which are like the standard libraries nowadays that you can use to, validate your endpoints and make sure everything is as expected. So this level is very important. So the logging level, you can use it to log the request and all of that, just for analytics. Nothing important. And this one, you can actually offshoot it to the background task. And what that does is that it doesn't wait for request. So you just like give it to a different thread to process, right? And now, with all of this set up, you can make a request to your database, and the database can come up and return data, get a response, and at the end of the day, your clients basically get the final response, and everybody is happy. In this setting, you will never encounter a situation where your app is down due to a malicious attacker trying to make like a million requests per second and all of that. So that will never happen. There is, though, a different layer, which I think is very important to cover, which has to do with the bucket, right? So the S3 bucket. So now we're going to talk about this more in a different, in a different section in a bit. Because why I think this is important is that I have seen lots of misuse of how you basically send data to your S3 and all of that, right? So we're going to talk more about this, how you can make your app more performant using the S3 um, SDK, basically. Right. So let's talk about this in the next episode. All right. Catch you on the next one.